The Barrett M82A1 lay disassembled on the aluminum table like the skeleton of some prehistoric predator. Each component gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of forward operating Base Titan, meticulously cleaned and oiled by hands that moved with the precision of a surgeon. Captain Vera Ghostwalk Kovalenko didn't look up when the boots approached. She knew that particular swagger, that deliberate heel strike designed to announce importance. Well, well, look what the Air Force dragged in. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reaper Davidson's voice carried the kind of condescension that came standard with Army Special Operations. Didn't know they let pilots play with real guns. The maintenance bay fell silent. Even the distant thrum of generators seemed to pause, waiting. Vera's hands never stopped moving, threading the cleaning rod through the barrel with methodical precision. She'd heard variations of this conversation in 7 different countries, 4 time zones, and more forward operating bases than she cared to count. The only thing that changed was the accent of the man delivering it. "Careful with that, sweetheart," Davidson continued, his voice loud enough to carry to the dozen other operators scattered throughout the bay. "Wouldn't want you to break a nail." She set down the cleaning rod and looked up for the first time. Davidson stood 6'2" in his combat boots, arms crossed, that insufferable smirk spreading across his stubbled face. Behind him, his spotter, a wiry kid everyone called Numbers, shifted uncomfortably, already sensing where this was heading. "It's a beautiful weapon," Vera said quietly, her slight Ukrainian accent making each word deliberate. She reassembled the rifle with fluid motions, each piece clicking into place with mechanical certainty. Effective range of 1,800 meters for most shooters. Some claim 2,000 if conditions are perfect. Most shooters, sure. Davidson's grin widened. But we're not talking about most shooters, are we? The challenge hung in the desert air between them like heat shimmer. Around the bay, conversations died. Tools stopped moving. Even the constant radio chatter from the command post seemed to fade to whispers. In places like this, reputation was currency, and everyone could sense a transaction about to take place. Vera stood, the assembled Barrett cradled in her arms like a sleeping child. At 5'6", she barely reached Davidson's shoulder, but something in her posture made the height difference irrelevant. Her flight suit bore the subdued patches of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. But it was the smaller patch beneath her name tape that made Davidson's smile falter slightly. A coiled snake with wings, the insignia of aerial sniper operations. "What exactly are you proposing, Sergeant?" Davidson recovered quickly, puffing out his chest. "Range competition. You and me. Let's see if those Air Force shooting courses are worth the taxpayer money." The bay erupted in murmurs and scattered laughter. Someone called out odds. Another voice shouted about making it interesting, but Vera heard none of it. She was studying Davidson's face, reading the micro-expressions that most people missed. The slight tightness around his eyes, the way his left hand unconsciously flexed, the barely perceptible shift in his stance. This wasn't about marksmanship. This was about something else entirely. The compound shooting range stretched out into the Afghan wasteland like a scar across the desert floor. Target stands dotted the landscape at measured intervals. 100 meters, 300, 500, 800, 1,000. Beyond that, the mountains rose like ancient guardians, their peaks lost in the perpetual haze of dust and heat. It was here, in this unforgiving terrain, that the world's best snipers came to prove themselves against distance, wind, and their own limitations. Word of the competition had spread through the base like wildfire. Off-duty personnel emerged from air-conditioned containers and armored vehicles, drawn by the promise of entertainment and the rare opportunity to see ego collide with reality. The smart money was on Davidson, Army Special Operations, 2 combat deployments, confirmed kills at distances that most people couldn't even see. But there were whispers about the pilot too. Stories that seemed too outlandish to believe. A helicopter shot down over Helmand Province, the crew pinned down by insurgents. No close air support available, no artillery, just a damaged bird and 4 souls waiting to die. They said she'd pulled a rifle from the wreckage and systematically eliminated threats at impossible ranges, calling out adjustments like she was directing traffic. They said she'd saved her entire crew with shots that shouldn't have been possible. They said a lot of things about Captain Kovalenko. Standard rules, Davidson announced, addressing the growing crowd like a prizefighter before the main event. Best of 3 at 800 meters, then we move back to 1,200 if it's tied. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled faces. Unless the lady wants to make this more interesting. Vera knelt beside her rifle, checking the scope mounting one final time. The Leupold Mark IV was a precision instrument, but even the best glass in the world couldn't account for human error. She'd zeroed this particular rifle 2 days ago, firing group after group until the adjustments were burned into muscle memory. "What did you have in mind?" she asked without looking up. Davidson's smirk returned full force. 3,800 meters, single shot, winner takes all. The crowd went silent. 3,800 meters, nearly 2.5 miles. At that distance, a bullet would be in the air for over 6 seconds, subject to wind drift, temperature variation, and the Earth's own rotation. It was beyond the rifle's effective range, beyond what any reasonable person would attempt. It was the kind of shot that existed only in war stories and barroom boasts. Major Harrison pushed through the crowd, his expression thunderous. "Belay that noise, Davidson. Nobody's taking shots at 4,000 meters on my range." "Sir, with respect," Davidson replied, his tone carefully measured. "The range extends to 4,200 meters. We've got spotting scopes, laser rangefinders, weather data. It's perfectly safe." "Safe for who? You planning to hike out there and check what's behind your backstop?" Vera finally looked up from her rifle. "There's nothing behind the 4,000-meter mark but empty desert, sir. No roads, no structures. I've studied the aerial reconnaissance photos." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Sergeant Davidson is right. It's a safe shot lane." The major's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "You're seriously considering this?" "I'm considering the mathematics, sir. Ballistic coefficient of the .50 BMG round, atmospheric conditions, target size, margin of error." She stood, slinging the rifle across her shoulder. "It's an interesting problem." Numbers. Davidson's spotter leaned close to his shooter. "Boss, maybe we should dial this back a notch. 4,000 meters is..." "Is what?" Davidson snapped. "Too far for Air Force Princess here. I figured as much." The insult hung in the desert air like cordite smoke. Vera felt the weight of 100 eyes, the pressure of expectations and assumptions. She thought of her grandfather's words, spoken in a language most of these men would never learn. Sometimes the strongest response is silence. Sometimes it is thunder. "1 shot each," she said quietly. 3,800 meters, standard man-sized silhouette target. Major Harrison threw up his hands in surrender. "Fine, but I want spotters at every interval, safety observers, and medical on standby. This goes sideways, it's on all of you." The crowd began to disperse, some heading toward the distant target stand with binoculars and rangefinders, others settling in behind the firing line with folding chairs and coolers. What had started as casual entertainment was transforming into something else, a test that would be talked about in mess halls and ready rooms for years to come. Davidson chambered a round with theatrical precision, the bolt sliding home with mechanical finality. His position was textbook perfect, prone, supported, natural point of aim. Through his scope, the target at 3,800 meters appeared as little more than a gray smudge against the mountainous backdrop. "Winds out of the southwest at 8 knots, Numbers called out, reading from his handheld anemometer. "Temperatures 94 degrees, humidity at 12%, barometric pressure 29.8 inches. All the data in the world couldn't account for the butterflies in Davidson's stomach. He'd never attempted a shot this far. Few had. The longest confirmed kill in Afghanistan belonged to a British sniper at 2,475 meters, and that had been with a larger caliber rifle under ideal conditions. This was beyond the realm of precision shooting and into the territory of educated guessing. He settled behind his rifle, feeling the familiar weight of the stock against his shoulder. Through the scope, he could barely make out the target stand. At this distance, even a perfect shot could be defeated by a momentary gust of wind or a slight miscalculation in elevation. The margin of error was measured in inches, but the consequences were measured in reputation. The trigger brake was clean, surprising him as much as it did the crowd. The .50 caliber round exploded from the barrel in a tongue of flame and thunder that rolled across the desert like artillery fire. Through the scope, Davidson watched for impact, counting the seconds as his bullet arced through the thin mountain air. 5 seconds, 6, 7. "Miss," called the spotter at the 3,800-meter line. No impact observed. Davidson's jaw tightened. He'd expected as much, but the public failure still stung. Around him, the crowd murmured with polite disappointment, the kind of sound that follows a strikeout in the bottom of the ninth. He cleared the chamber and stepped back from the firing line, his moment of glory dissolving into the afternoon heat. "Your turn, Captain." Vera approached the firing line with the same methodical precision she'd shown cleaning her weapon. She didn't kneel immediately, instead standing behind her rifle and studying the distant mountains through binoculars. The target was invisible to the naked eye, a theoretical point in space that existed more as mathematics than reality. "Spotter's reading?" she asked. The NCO with the weather instruments rattled off the same data he'd given Davidson: wind speed, temperature, humidity, pressure. Standard atmospheric conditions for southern Afghanistan in summer. Nothing unexpected, nothing that couldn't be calculated and compensated for. But Vera wasn't listening to the instruments. She was feeling the wind on her face, watching the heat shimmer rise from the desert floor, observing how the distant mountains seemed to dance in the superheated air. These were the variables that no machine could measure, the countless tiny factors that could send a bullet wide by feet or inches. She knelt behind her rifle and began her ritual. First, the sling adjustment. The nylon strap had to be positioned precisely against her supporting arm, tight enough to provide stability but not so tight as to restrict circulation. Next, the scope alignment. At this distance, even a slight cant in the rifle could result in catastrophic error. The crosshairs had to be perfectly vertical, the rifle perfectly level. Through the Leupold's magnified optics, the world transformed. The distant target stand materialized from the heat haze, still small but now clearly defined against the rocky backdrop. She could see the silhouette target itself, a black humanoid shape on a white background, regulation size and proportions. The mathematics began automatically, her mind processing calculations that had been drilled into muscle memory through thousands of hours of training. Bullet drop at 3,800 meters would be approximately 978 inches, over 81 feet. She'd need to aim at a point in empty sky, trusting physics and ballistics to bring her round down onto target. Wind drift was more complex. The bullet would be subject to varying wind conditions throughout its 6-second flight, starting with the steady southwest breeze at the firing line, but potentially encountering different conditions as it arced over the uneven terrain. She estimated a total drift of approximately 4 feet to the left, but it was educated guesswork at best. Her breathing settled into the familiar pattern: deep inhale, half exhale, hold. In the sustained pause between breaths, her heartbeat slowed, her vision sharpened. The world narrowed to the small circle of clarity visible through her scope. The crosshairs settled on a point roughly 15 feet above and 4 feet left of the target. To anyone watching, it would appear that she was aiming at empty air. In a sense, she was. This wasn't precision shooting. It was an act of faith, a belief that physics and skill could bridge an impossible distance. The trigger pulled straight back with steady pressure, no jerking, no anticipation. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with familiar violence, and the .50 caliber round began its journey through the thin Afghan air. 6 seconds had never felt so long. The impact came like distant thunder, a sound that rolled across the desert floor and echoed off the distant mountains. Through her scope, Vera watched a small puff of dust rise from the hillside behind the target stand. For a moment, silence held the firing line like a held breath. Then the radio crackled to life. "Holy shit," came the voice of the spotter at 3,800 meters. "That's a hit. Center mass, high chest. Say again, that is a confirmed hit." The crowd erupted. Cheers, curses, and expressions of disbelief filled the desert air as personnel crowded around the spotting scopes to confirm what seemed impossible. Through high-powered optics, they could see the hole punch through the center of the silhouette target, as clean and precise as if it had been made from 50 meters instead of 50 football fields. Davidson stared through his own scope, his face cycling through emotions like a slot machine. Disbelief gave way to anger, anger to grudging respect, respect to something that might have been awe. The shot he just witnessed violated everything he thought he knew about the limitations of small arms fire. "Jesus Christ," Numbers whispered. "How the hell did she make that shot?" Vera cleared her rifle's chamber and engaged the safety with the same methodical precision she'd shown throughout. She didn't celebrate, didn't acknowledge the crowd's reaction, didn't even look toward Davidson. Instead, she began breaking down her weapon with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed this ritual thousands of times. "Ma'am," Davidson said quietly, his voice stripped of its earlier bravado, that was something else." She looked up from her rifle case, meeting his eyes for the first time since the competition had begun. "It was mathematics, Sergeant, just mathematics." But they both knew it had been more than that. Mathematics couldn't account for the intuitive understanding of wind and weather that came from thousands of hours in cockpits, reading the sky like a book. Mathematics couldn't explain the steady hands that had guided helicopters through hostile fire, or the calm heartbeat that had learned to slow under pressure. Mathematics certainly couldn't explain the small, knowing smile that played at the corners of her mouth as she walked away from the firing line, leaving behind a crowd of silent, staring faces and one humbled special operations soldier who would never again make assumptions about pilots and their capabilities. The story of that shot would spread through the military community like a virus, growing with each telling. Some would claim she'd hit a bullseye. Others would insist she'd called her shot like Babe Ruth. A few would whisper that it had been nothing but luck, though they'd never say it loud enough for her to hear. But for those who'd been there, who'd watched her prepare and fire with the cold precision of a machine, the truth was simpler and more unsettling. They just witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible, performed by someone they'd completely underestimated. The mess hall at Fob Titan buzzed with an undercurrent of electricity that evening, conversations dying and resuming as Vera passed between tables with her dinner tray. She'd chosen a corner table as always, preferring observation to participation, but tonight the usual comfortable anonymity was replaced by a weight of attention that followed her like a shadow. She ate mechanically, her mind replaying the afternoon's events not with satisfaction but with analytical precision. The shot had been good, better than good, but luck had played a larger role than she cared to admit. A gust of wind 5 seconds earlier or later, a momentary tremor in her grip, a fraction of a degree error in scope alignment, and the bullet would have sailed harmlessly into the Afghan wilderness. "Mind if we sit?" She looked up to find Davidson and Numbers standing beside her table, trays in hand, expressions carefully neutral. The mess hall had gone silent around them. 200 pairs of eyes watching the drama unfold over plates of reconstituted beef stew and powdered mashed potatoes. "Free country," she said, then caught herself. "Free base." Davidson settled across from her with uncharacteristic humility, his usual swagger replaced by something that might have been respect. Numbers took the chair beside him, stealing glances at Vera like she might sprout wings or breathe fire. "I owe you an apology," Davidson said without preamble. "What I said earlier about pilots playing with real guns, that was out of line." Vera cut a piece of mystery meat with surgical precision. "You weren't wrong. Most pilots don't spend their off-duty time at the rifle range." "Yeah, but most pilots aren't you." The comment hung between them like a question mark. Around the mess hall, conversations gradually resumed as it became clear that no blood would be spilled over dinner. But the attention remained, a subtle shift in the social ecosystem of the base. Word had spread beyond the firing range, carried by the inexorable military gossip network that could transmit information faster than encrypted radio. "Tell me something," Davidson continued, leaning forward slightly. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that? Air Force doesn't exactly specialize in long-range marksmanship." Vera considered her response carefully. The truth was complicated, woven from threads of family history and personal obsession that most people wouldn't understand. Her grandfather had been a sniper in the Soviet Army during World War II, one of the feared marksmen who terrorized German forces around Stalingrad. He taught her to shoot before she could properly hold a rifle, passing down skills that had been sharpened by necessity and tempered by survival. But that was only part of the story. The rest involved late nights on civilian ranges, advanced marksmanship courses paid for with her own money, and countless hours of practice driven by a need to excel that went deeper than professional requirement. She'd pursued marksmanship with the same intensity she brought to flying, turning it from hobby to obsession to art form. "Family tradition," she said finally. "My grandfather believed that precision was a form of prayer." Numbers looked confused, but Davidson nodded slowly. He'd seen enough combat to understand that some skills were passed down through bloodlines like heirlooms, inherited wisdom that couldn't be taught in schools or training programs. "That shot this afternoon," he said. "You make a habit of practicing at extreme range." "I practice at whatever range challenges me. Today, that happened to be 3,800 meters." The answer was both truthful and evasive, revealing nothing while implying everything. Davidson studied her face, searching for tells that would indicate boastfulness or false modesty, but found only the same calm competence she displayed on the firing line. "Numbers here thinks you got lucky," he said, ignoring his spotter's sharp look. "Says nobody makes that shot on purpose, not even the pros." Vera looked at the younger soldier, nodding the intelligence behind his skeptical expression. Numbers was probably right. At that range, even the best shooters in the world succeeded through a combination of skill and fortune. But luck was a word that diminished achievement, reducing complex human capability to mere chance. "Your friend is smart," she said. "At that distance, there are dozens of variables beyond any shooter's control. Wind shear, temperature gradients, even the Earth's rotation becomes a factor. Any one of them could have sent my bullet wide." "But it didn't." "No, it didn't." Davidson grinned, the expression transforming his face from cocky to genuinely pleased. "You know what I think? I think you've been sandbagged, not signed us, playing the quiet pilot while secretly being Annie Oakley with a Barrett." Annie Oakley never engaged targets at 3,800 meters. "Fair point." He pushed back from the table, decision made. "Numbers and I are running a training exercise tomorrow morning. Advanced marksmanship for some of the newer guys. You interested in sharing some of that family wisdom?" The invitation surprised her. Military culture was notoriously hierarchical and insular, with each branch guarding its specialties jealously. For an Army Special Operations team to invite an Air Force pilot to instruct their personnel was almost unprecedented. "What makes you think I'd be qualified to teach your soldiers?" Davidson's laugh drew attention from nearby tables. "Ma'am, after today, I'm pretty sure you're qualified to teach anybody anything they want to know about putting rounds on target." The next morning found Vera on the firing line before dawn, checking equipment and setting up targets while the first purple light of sunrise painted the eastern mountains. The temperature was already climbing toward another brutal day, but the early hour provided a brief respite from the relentless heat that would soon make extended outdoor activity nearly unbearable. She'd spent the night reviewing lesson plans in her head, trying to distill years of experience into digestible fragments that could be absorbed and applied by soldiers whose primary focus was assault tactics rather than precision shooting. The challenge wasn't just technical, it was cultural, requiring her to bridge the gap between Air Force methodology and Army expectations. Davidson arrived with 6 soldiers in tow, all sporting the confident swagger of Special Operations personnel who'd never met a challenge they couldn't overcome. They were young, fit, and professionally competent, but their body language suggested they were humoring their team leader rather than embracing the opportunity to learn from a pilot. "Gentlemen," Davidson announced, "meet Captain Kovalenko. She'll be working with us on extended-range shooting techniques." The introductions were perfunctory, first names only in the casual manner of Special Operations units. Rodriguez, Thompson, Park, Williams, Jackson, and McKenzie, 6 soldiers whose combined combat experience probably exceeded her own, yet who regarded her with the polite skepticism reserved for outsiders bearing unwanted advice. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, his tone respectful but distant, "no offense, but most of us have been through advanced marksmanship training. We know how to shoot." It wasn't a challenge exactly, but it wasn't enthusiasm either. Vera recognized the dynamic from her own training experiences, competent professionals protecting their egos while simultaneously curious about what they might learn. "I'm sure you do," she replied evenly. "But how many of you have successfully engaged targets beyond 2,000 meters?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Long-range precision shooting was a specialized skill set, one that required dedicated training and constant practice to maintain. Most military snipers operated effectively out to 1,000 meters, with anything beyond that range considered exceptional rather than routine. "The fundamentals remain the same regardless of distance," she continued, gesturing toward the rifle rests arranged along the firing line. "Breathing, sight alignment, trigger control, follow-through. What changes is the complexity of the calculations and the margin for error." She moved to the first shooting position, where a rifle identical to hers waited on its bipod. The soldiers gathered around, their skepticism beginning to transform into professional curiosity as she began breaking down the technical aspects of extreme-range shooting. "At 1,000 meters, bullet drop is approximately 32 inches, she said, adjusting the scope elevation with practiced precision. "Manageable, predictable within the capability of most quality rifle systems. But at 2,000 meters, drop increases to 142 inches, nearly 12 feet. At 3,000 meters, we're looking at over 400 inches of drop." Thompson, a lanky soldier with intelligent eyes, raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do you calculate that without a ballistic computer?" "You don't, not precisely. But you can get close enough with field-expedient methods if you understand the underlying physics." She spent the next 30 minutes walking them through manual ballistic calculations, using simplified formulas that could be applied in the field without electronic assistance. The soldiers took notes, asked questions, and gradually began to shed their initial reluctance as they realized they were receiving genuinely useful information. The practical exercise began at 800 meters, a distance that challenged but didn't overwhelm. Vera moved between shooters, offering subtle adjustments to position and technique while observing how each soldier approached the problem of precision shooting. Some were naturally gifted, their shots clustering tightly around the target center. Others struggled with consistency, their groups scattered by minor variations in form or concentration. "Park, you're pulling your shots left," she called out after watching his third miss. "Your trigger finger is hooking around the trigger instead of using the pad. Try again with proper finger placement." The next shot centered perfectly, drawing an appreciative whistle from Rodriguez. "Damn, LT. Guess the lady knows what she's talking about." As the morning progressed, Vera found herself enjoying the teaching role more than she'd anticipated. There was satisfaction in watching skilled professionals improve their capabilities, in seeing the moment when a concept clicked and translated into improved performance. These weren't raw recruits who needed to be taught everything from scratch. They were competent soldiers who simply needed refinement and advanced techniques. The session concluded with each soldier successfully engaging targets at 1,200 meters, distances that had seemed impossible when they'd started. The improvement was dramatic and immediate, testament both to their existing skills and their willingness to absorb new information once they'd accepted its value. "Outstanding work," Davidson told his team as they began cleaning weapons. "I want everyone to incorporate these techniques into your individual training programs." Questions? Mackenzie, who'd been the most skeptical at the beginning of the session, raised his hand. "Ma'am, that shot yesterday at 3,800 meters. How often could you make that same shot? I mean, realistically." It was the question she'd been expecting, the one that cut to the heart of whether yesterday's success had been skill or luck. The honest answer was complicated, involving factors that went beyond simple marksmanship into areas of environmental conditions, equipment consistency, and human performance variables. Under identical conditions with the same rifle and ammunition, same weather and wind patterns, she paused, considering. Maybe 60%, 70% on a good day. The estimate was conservative, but it acknowledged the reality that extreme-range shooting involved elements beyond any shooter's control. Even the world's best snipers missed shots at extreme range more often than they connected, which made yesterday's success impressive rather than routine. "That's still pretty damn good odds," Jackson observed. "Better than most of us could manage at half that distance." Davidson nodded agreement. "Which brings up an interesting point. Captain, would you be available to continue these sessions? Maybe work with some of our other teams?" The invitation represented more than just additional training opportunities. It was acceptance into a community that rarely welcomed outsiders, recognition that her skills had value beyond her primary role as a pilot. The chance to share knowledge and improve capabilities across service branches was exactly the kind of professional development that could benefit everyone involved. "I'd be honored," she replied, "but only if your command structure approves. Inter-service training requires proper authorization." "Leave that to me," Davidson said with renewed confidence. "After yesterday, I don't think we'll have trouble getting approval for whatever training you want to provide." As the soldiers dispersed to other duties, Vera remained on the firing line, cleaning her rifle and processing the morning's events. The sun was climbing toward its merciless midday peak, but for the first time since arriving at Fob Titan, she felt like more than just another transient professional passing through. She'd found her place in the complex ecosystem of military specialization, earned respect through demonstration rather than reputation. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, harsh and unforgiving, but beautiful in its own austere way. Somewhere out there, at a distance that challenged human capability and technological precision, targets waited to test the skills she'd inherited from her grandfather and refined through countless hours of dedicated practice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to push the boundaries of what was possible with rifle and scope and steady hands. But today had been enough, a bridge built between services, between individuals, between the possible and the proven. She smiled as she packed her equipment, already planning the next lesson. 3 weeks later, the legend had taken on a life of its own. The story of the impossible shot had spread through military channels like wildfire, growing and evolving with each telling, until the facts had been seasoned with speculation and served with generous portions of embellishment. Some versions had her hitting multiple targets in sequence. Others claimed she'd been blindfolded, or firing from a helicopter, or using iron sights instead of a scope. Vera listened to these evolving tales with bemused detachment, recognizing the military's innate need to transform competence into mythology. In a profession where reputation could mean the difference between respect and dismissal, extraordinary achievements quickly became legendary achievements, facts smoothed into folklore through repetition and imagination. The training sessions had continued, expanding beyond Davidson's team to include personnel from across the base. Her small corner of the firing range had become an unofficial school for advanced marksmanship, drawing students from Army Special Forces, Navy SEALs, Marine reconnaissance units, and even civilian contractors with security responsibilities. Each session brought new challenges as she adapted her teaching methods to different skill levels and operational requirements. Captain Major Harrison called out as she passed the command post, "Got a minute?" She followed him into his office, nodding the additional personnel present, a lieutenant colonel she didn't recognize, and a civilian whose suit and bearing suggested intelligence community involvement. The atmosphere was formal, suggesting this wasn't a casual conversation about training schedules or equipment requests. "Captain Kovalenko," the major began, "I'd like you to meet Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Stone from 5th Special Forces Group and Mr. William Chen from the agency. They have a proposition for you." Stone was compact and efficient-looking, with the kind of weathered competence that came from years of field operations. Chen appeared to be in his 40s, unremarkable in every way except for eyes that seemed to catalog and analyze everything they encountered. Both studied Vera with the intensity of people evaluating an asset. "Captain," Stone said without preamble, "we understand you've been conducting advanced marksmanship training for special operations personnel." "Yes, ma'am, with Major Harrison's approval and coordination with unit commanders." The feedback has been exceptional. Unit performance scores have improved dramatically, and several team leaders have specifically requested continuation of your training programs. Stone paused, exchanging glances with Chen. "Which brings us to why we're here." Chen leaned forward slightly. "Captain, are you familiar with Operation Quiet Thunder?" The name meant nothing to her, but the tone and context suggested classified information above her current clearance level. "No, sir." "It's a joint service initiative focused on developing advanced capabilities for precision engagement at extreme ranges. Your recent demonstration and subsequent training success have brought you to our attention as someone who might contribute to the program's objectives." The conversation was dancing around something, hints and implications rather than direct statements. Vera recognized the pattern from previous encounters with intelligence personnel. Everything important was said through indirection, leaving room for denial or reinterpretation if circumstances changed. "What kind of contribution?" she asked carefully. Stone took over. "Initially, curriculum development and instructor qualification for specialized training programs. Eventually, possibly direct operational support for time-sensitive targets that require precision engagement beyond conventional capability." The euphemisms were clear enough. They wanted her to help train elite snipers for extreme-range shots, and potentially to take those shots herself when circumstances required capabilities that didn't officially exist. It was flattering and terrifying in equal measure, recognition of her skills coupled with an invitation into the shadow world of deniable operations. "I appreciate the offer," she said slowly, but my primary duty is as a pilot with the 160th. Any additional assignments would need to be coordinated with my chain of command. Already done, Chen said with a slight smile. Your commanding officer has been briefed and has granted provisional approval, pending your acceptance of the program requirements. The speed and thoroughness of their preparation was impressive and slightly unsettling. These weren't people making impulsive decisions based on rumors and stories. They'd clearly been watching, evaluating, and planning for some time before making their approach. What would be required, she asked. Additional security clearances, specialized training at undisclosed locations, and periodic temporary duty assignments as operational requirements dictate. Stone's tone was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing routine administrative procedures rather than invitation into black operations. Your pilot duties would continue normally, with the understanding that other commitments might occasionally take precedence. The offer represented everything she'd never known she wanted: recognition of her abilities, opportunities to work at the highest levels of military capability, and challenges that would push her skills to their absolute limits. But it also meant crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed, accepting responsibilities that would follow her for the rest of her career. I need time to consider this, she said. Of course, take whatever time you need. Chen stood, extending a business card that contained nothing but a phone number. When you've made your decision, call that number. Someone will be available to answer any questions you might have. They left her alone with Major Harrison, who'd remained silent throughout the exchange. He looked tired, carrying the weight of responsibilities that extended beyond the normal scope of base command. "Sir," she began, "can you tell me anything about these people or what they're really asking?" Harrison was quiet for a long moment, staring out the small window at the endless Afghan landscape. "I can tell you that they're legitimate, that the program they described exists, and that your country would benefit from your participation." He turned to face her directly. "I can also tell you that once you cross that line, there's no going back to being just a pilot who happens to be good with a rifle." "And your recommendation?" "My recommendation is that you follow your instincts. You've got good judgment and better skills than most people realize. Whatever you decide, make sure it's something you can live with for the long term." That evening, Vera sat on her cot in the small container that served as her quarters, Chen's business card balanced on her fingertips like a scale weight. Outside,